Welcome back. A special welcome to a guest we had the privilege of interviewing some time ago, and we wanted to get back to talk a bit more in detail about the fruits of some of his work. He is, by training and considerable uh, accomplishment, a very, very prominent plastic surgeon in the Washington, D.C. area. He has, however, in the course of, well, living the Hippocratic Oath, taken up the cause of trying to help people be healthy, not just look good. His name is Dr. Mark Richards. He is the author, among other things, of a book entitled Nobody Wants You Healthy, which is a rather chilling thought. We wanted to explore it with him. He brings to all of this not only a 33-year record of service, as I say, in one of the most, well, uh, I think, valued lines of medical activity, but also as a leader in a variety of national and surgical medical societies. And it's always a pleasure to have him with us. Welcome back, Doctor. Good to have you.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to start with the proposition that's in the title of your book. Nobody wants you healthy. Now, we spend God only knows how many billions of dollars every year, if not trillions, on the whole proposition that we're trying to keep people healthy or make them healthy. How is it that you feel that that's not actually what's motivating, among others, I guess, the medical institutions and government agencies responsible?
Well, thank you. Let's look at the numbers. So the numbers are pre-COVID, the U.S. was spending over $2 trillion a year on healthcare. And of that 2 trillion, 80% was going to treat chronic diseases. We have well over 50% of Americans have at least one, if not multiple, chronic diseases. When you're looking at the Medicare population, the over 65 population, 96 cents of every dollar that gets spent in healthcare is for chronic diseases. Now, I like to say this is not a grand conspiracy among all the players that are getting very rich off this. It's just each one acting, at the very least, unethically and maximizing their own profit and showing a total disregard for the health and welfare of the US population. How does this happen? Well, actually, it was an environmental catastrophe that really set the medical industry, particularly pharmacologic industry, as well as the healthcare systems, on the path to riches. In the 60s, we developed plastics. If you remember that movie, The Graduate, where Benjamin gets out of the pool and gets slapped on the back and says, "Plastics, my son, plastics, that's where you got to go."
I have one word for you. Plastics, right?
That's right, one word. Sadly, that one word is coming back to really bite us in the ass, because a chemical in plastics called phthalates is the most powerful hormone disruptors we've ever mass produced. So at this point, we manufacture 200 times the toxic dose of phthalates annually for every man, woman, child on the planet. Now, phthalates
I'm sorry, say that again.
We manufacture 200 times the toxic dose of phthalates for every man, woman, child on the planet.
We manufacture it in a certain period of time, or we have cumulatively done that?
We're doing that every year. We're manufacturing that amount every year. And of course, the phthalates are still in the environment from the manufacture of the previous decade.
They do not break down. They do not
They do not break down very easily at all. So we have microscopic plastic in the air to the point where over 80% of blood samples, if you microfilter them, actually has microscopic plastic in people's blood because it gets absorbed through the little alveoli in your lungs.
Wow. And then there's fish, as I understand it, that are consuming this stuff, and we're consuming them, obviously.
Well, of course, yeah. We have all sorts of plastics being dumped in the ocean, and it's killing our marine life. In this area where we live, we have a Chesapeake Bay, a beautiful waterway, and at least 3 of the rivers have sea bass or rockfish, where 60% of the fish coming into the bay from these rivers are intersex. They're neither male nor female, and they can't reproduce, and it's directly related to the phthalates in the water.
So if it's doing that to fish, it's probably not too good for us either. And is there a direct connection between these phthalates and chronic diseases of various kinds in humans?
Well, that's exactly what I'm circling around to. So you nailed it. If it's not good for fish, it's probably not good for mammals either. And in fact, the hormone that's the most abundant hormone of all humans, their entire life, male or female, and as a matter of fact, the most abundant hormone in most all animals is testosterone. And testosterone plays into this because it's not what the media presents as a sex hormone or a male masculine hormone. It's actually the hormone that controls inflammation and it controls metabolism. So if you become inflamed, guess what you create? Chronic diseases, right?
Which are
Alzheimer's is chronic
basically
disease
associated with inflammation, as I
with
understand
all
it.
associated with inflammation. So if your testosterone's low, you have a high inflammatory state, which means you're much more likely to have strokes, heart attacks, depression, anxiety, breast cancer, uh, a number of things. And if your metabolic control is out of whack, then you're much more likely to become diabetic and obese. And if you look at the diseases that are afflicting our population, that have become epidemic, it's all of those diseases related to inflammation and metabolism. Now, how can that be from this little chemical in plastics? Well, we now know that compared to 1970, men and women's testosterone is less than 40% of what it was back in 1970. We have a 60% reduction.
And the layperson, at least this one, never thinks of women having testosterone at all, let alone that they might have inadequate levels of it. This is having the same effect on them as on men, causing inflammation and inviting all of these diseases associated with it.
Yes, yes. And the reason why people were confused and the medical education process was so wrong was they were looking at blood levels. And it turns out that women make the vast majority of testosterone inside each of their cells, and men make most of it outside of their cells in their testicles, and it gets transported through the blood and transported into the cells. However, we're the same golden retriever. So we both have the ability, male and female, have the ability to make it inside the cell and to make it externally. The problem is phthalates not only can go through and into each cell and disrupt the production of testosterone, they can go across the placenta and affect the fetuses. So now you have fetal damage that changes it, and it's called epigenetics, where it changes the DNA in these animals and it gets passed on to their offspring. So a phthalate exposure from a mother animal now with a newborn inside is going to have grandchildren with defects that were caused by the phthalates that her child was exposed to in utero.
So this gets pretty technical pretty quick, but just to make sure that we're on point here, as I understand it, what you've laid out is if you don't do something about the inflammation and the source of the inflammation, whatever you do to ameliorate or treat the symptoms of the disease is not actually going to spare you the problems associated with the disease. Is that
And
basically what you're
that's
at?
exactly right. So let's look at one example. Let's look at female menopause. Now, female menopause is a reduction of testosterone to insufficient levels. All the estrogen inside your cells or my cells is made inside the cell from testosterone. The stuff circulating in the bloodstream never gets in the cells and does you much good. So if you have low testosterone, then you and your wife both have menopausal symptoms. And we call it andropause in men and menopause in women. But worse than that, it's a sign of the increased inflammation that your body's having. So you're having plaques put in your arteries, plaques put in your carotid arteries, your heart arteries. You're having depression, anxiety, irritability as your brain's inflamed. It increases your risk of breast cancer by 40%. You can't control your immune system. And this is a very enriching process for the pharmaceutical industry and for the organized medicine.
Now, you're not suggesting that if you had higher levels of testosterone, you wouldn't have menopause in women or andropause in men, are you? You're just saying that it would
That's
be.
exactly what I'm telling you. That is exactly what I'm telling you. So when I treat women for menopausal symptoms, what you consider menopausal symptoms, they get a testosterone pellet, like a Tic Tac, just put underneath the skin into the fat, and they get 3 months of steady state high levels of testosterone, and their menopausal symptoms are 99% gone. Same for
But
men.
are they still going through menopause? They're just not having symptoms. Isn't menopause just a natural phenomenon that is the
Menopause
end of that
is
sort
a
of fertile cycle?
symptom. Well, yeah, menopause is a symptom complex. So menopause is actually the clinical symptoms you experience, whether you're male or female. We just call it andropause in men. And they are caused by low testosterone, inadequate testosterone. Because if your testosterone is inadequate, not only is that hormone down, but you're not making adequate amounts of estrogen either. So you get, for example, osteoporosis or weak bones. As an example of this in men, we didn't see men with osteoporosis and broken hips and those sort of things, until they hit their 80s. Now we're seeing it in their 50s because the testosterone is so low they can't make enough estrogen in their bones to keep the bones strong.
And this again brings us back to the phthalates that they're
Brings us
being
back to
subjected
phthalates.
to without any kind of correction. So, is we have to take a very short break, Dr. Mark Richards. But when we come back, I want to just explore, what do you do about the phthalates as well as what do you do about the hormones? We'll get into all of that and more on the other side of this short break with us. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Mark Richards, a highly accomplished plastic surgeon by training and practice, but also a man who has devoted much of his life to figuring out how do you keep people healthy, not just looking like they're healthy. And this brings us to the title of his new book, Nobody Wants You Healthy. And Doctor, you were laying out, I think, a fascinating story of basically what we've done environmentally to our hormones, which is translated into particularly testosterone, being greatly diminished in men and women, resulting in inflammation, which manifests itself in a whole variety of diseases. And the question that occurs is, so what do you do about it? And you've obviously got, with these testosterone pellets, an approach that addresses some of the physical problems with testosterone attrition, shall we say. Um, but you're also, I know, focused on the phthalates problem, the plastics that are the cause of the attack on the hormones. Is that right?
That's true. One thing, I can make people healthier with testosterone pellets. It's been around since 1939 and used to be taught in medical schools until about 1960s when synthetic hormones were created and patented and could enrich the companies. But the problem with phthalates is they don't break down very well. And we need to use a substitute in all these miraculous plastics that we've been developing. And those are more expensive substitutes, but we don't have a choice. We have to do it, or human life and animal life on the planet is really quite in jeopardy. Our infertility rates because of phthalates is skyrocketing.
So there are alternatives to phthalates that would enable plastics to still be valuable to us in a host of ways, but not the environmental nightmare that you've described.
We hope they're not the environmental nightmare. You remember when we were in plastics, it was fantastic. And then, 15 years later, we started saying, oh my God, what have we done with this? But by then it was too entrenched and it was benefiting, the powerful forces. The pharmaceutical industry is the largest lobbying donor by a factor of 2 compared to any other industry in the world. And they make 90% of the 1.4 trillion pre-COVID in revenues, 90% for treating chronic diseases, but never preventing them or curing them. So there's a huge financial incentive, both in the industry and in their political recipients, not to stop this money train from going.
But just back to the question on the plastics side, you're saying that these alternatives that avoid the phthalates problem may or may not have problems of their own. We just don't know enough about them at this point.
We are assuming that they don't have the same problems. And, the early studies show they don't have the same problems. But when you start looking at science studies, you really have to repeat them in multiple independent labs because there's a huge bias in all the science studies. As I say in my book, Nobody Wants You Healthy, over 75% of the science and medical articles in peer-reviewed journals are false because the authors don't want to be defunded.
And this brings me to big pharma and sort of our experience with it in COVID, particularly. Talk a little bit about what's been operating in the industry. I mean, obviously the profit motive, most especially, but it does seem as though, and our friend Naomi Wolf, Dr. Wolf and her team at Daily Cloud, working with a group from Steve Bannon's posse at War Room, have done unbelievable work exposing um, not just, I think, the unethical conduct, but the illegal conduct of Pfizer and Moderna in connection with these genetically manufactured so-called vaccines. Just give us a quick appraisal of how much of a problem big pharma is itself in all of this.
Well, the baseline, the baseline of what's been going on with the pharmaceutical industry and NIH and the FDA is one of corruption. Corruption because the money is so huge and the payouts are so good that people look out for their own interest. If you put on top of that the ability of the federal government to usurp any dissent, any scientific discussion, and any way that science is supposed to happen, and then you demand that people not only not discuss it, but that everybody either needs to get on board or get their license pulled if you don't recommend an experimental vaccine, you have I would agree with you, illegal situation that totally violated the Nuremberg Code, where we're trying to prevent biological, torture, experimentation, and that sort of thing out of the World War II and Nazi Germany. So it is a horrendous decision that was made. And we have people like, I'm not a huge fan, but Mark Zuckerberg admitting, yeah, we censored people that were telling the truth because, the government can make our job and our company go under. This is a tremendous abuse of power. Now, the FDA is funded partially by taxpayers, but the majority of the budget's by the pharmaceutical industry. And the FDA doesn't have the resources to even hire the statisticians and do a deep analysis of the data that the drug companies are presenting to them for the drugs they want to approve. So they end up de facto just accepting whatever the lawyers for the pharmaceutical industry say the facts are. And this is ridiculous, right?
Well,
When 75% of the research is false.
yeah, that point that it's false, the point that there's this vested interest in the pharmaceutical industry to perpetrate these frauds, basically, and that the sort of regulatory capture of the FDA has reached a point where, for reasons you've just described, Dr. Richards, they're wholly owned subsidiaries, it seems, of the pharmaceutical concerns, giving rise to a situation in which we're now seeing, it seems, these latest boosters and vaccines being approved without, I think, even mice being subjected to them for any length of time, for heaven's sakes. I mean, it's really chilling. And I think there's been such a complete erosion of confidence in the public health authorities and this complex, as it's called. People have different names for it, but it really does, I think, argue powerfully for the kind of wake-up call that you're offering here with your book. Nobody Wants You Healthy. We're going to talk more about it on the other side of a very short break. Stay tuned. I'll be right back. We're back, and we're visiting a little bit further with Dr. Mark Richards, a celebrated plastic surgeon, but a man who I think is now earning a very important reputation for leadership as well, in the whole idea that we could be healthier than we are if we weren't simply encouraged and, in some ways, I guess, compelled to treat just the symptoms. of disease rather than the underlying causes. And Dr. Richards, we were talking a bit about big pharma and its role, its self-interested role, resulting in, at least it would appear, a lot of unethical behavior, if not downright criminal conduct, notably in the COVID crisis. But from what you're saying, it seems their vested interest in selling us symptomatic treatments for everything without actually mitigating the underlying chronic diseases or the causes thereof. Talk just a little bit further about how, um, as a nation, we are going to have to come to grips with this. You've mentioned the possibility of coming up with alternative plastics, for example, that might help. You've talked about a specific treatment, course of treatment, testosterone pellet therapy. Um, First of all, what is the way forward there, and how can people learn more about both?
Well, I think the way forward is multi-pronged. People need to avoid as much as possible their exposure to phthalates. So water filtration system that takes out the plastics from your water is a very good start, since 98% of US tap water has plastic in it. Um, Making sure your food doesn't touch plastic, you don't cook it in plastic, that's another very good start. Trying to stay away from processed food, because phthalate lines cans, because it makes things flow smoothly. So frozen foods, foods in brown bags, foods wrapped by your butcher, those sort of things would be a really good start. Having uh, exercise, and also have your testosterone and estrogen levels measured to make sure that you are in a decent balance. The lab levels can't be trusted, because they're have dropped down as the population has dropped down. So the lab levels range that they say is not really the ideal. It just happens to be the range of a very sick population. So the doctors need to be educated about what a proper level is to reduce disease.
Fascinating. And to the extent that there is, let's just put it charitably, misconduct on the part of the pharmaceutical companies. You mentioned earlier the fact that the leverage they've got over the docs, directly or indirectly, leading in some cases to people losing their certification to practice medicine if they are championing, lower cost therapeutics, for example, for COVID instead of, these experimental, very expensive, very dangerous, it seems, vaccines. Um, what can we do about the power of big pharma in all of this?
You know, as one of my friends said, if Congress would do its job, we would be better off. But you have to remember that these Congress people on both sides of the aisle are making millions of dollars personally by getting inside information about what blockbuster drug is about to get approved, and then pressuring the FDA to approve them. It's a very corrupt system. So my point in my book was, I wanted to educate my fellow colleagues who are trying to do their best but totally misinformed, and the public. Because if the public demands it and my colleagues are educated, we can change things. But that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a groundswell, basically revolution, in order to change the way things are done.
Do you see in your colleagues a willingness to take the risks that are associated with that kind of groundswell, sir?
Yes, I don't think they're quite as outspoken in this message as I am, um, but they all are doing it privately with their patients. So there is a much bigger educational process going on than the government or pharma understands. When I wrote this book, it took quite a while, because I had to document every single thing I said with good science studies that prove my point, so that I wasn't considered some hack that they could easily dismiss. When they try to dismiss it, certain medical society groups, I said, read the book. They read the book. They're like, okay, you're right.
Well, and when 75% of the studies are wrong,
Yeah.
you obviously had to do a lot of culling there. Let me, in closing, sir, just ask you about a factor in all of this that I'm very worried about, that may make it even more difficult for us in the future to have the kind of, excuse me, public health um, quality and conduct that we need. And that is we're at the cusp, as I'm sure you know, of allowing an entity called the World Health Organization not only to provide advice about how we contend with medical crises of various kinds, but actually to dictate to us when we have one or when we potentially will have one and what we will do about them. And I think our experience with COVID was bad enough with these guys. What must we do to, as you see it, ensure we do not surrender our personal medical sovereignty as well as our national sovereignty to some unaccountable agency like the World Health Organization?
Excellent question. When I first heard what they were planning to do, I was terrified. But when I sat back and thought a little more rationally about it, as long as the judicial system, the Supreme Court, stays the course, and we get a complete change in the executive administrative branch, this sort of thing will never happen. The World Health Organization is run by an former economics minister from an African country. He had no basis in science, but a lot of basis in corruption and how to make money. And the people on the
And
board,
Marxism, by the way. Yeah.
yeah, and the people on the board of the World Health Organization are the ones that were funding Peter Daszak, were funneling the money from DOD and NIH to the Wuhan lab. So, I mean, it's just a totally corrupted organization. Dictators want total control, and that's what tyranny is. And if we can toss out the executive branch and maybe educate Congress and keep the judiciary system honest, I think the Constitution and the Bill of Rights will completely block any attempt from the World Health Organization to dictate anything to U.S. citizens.
Those are big ifs, sir. And we've got to do everything we can, I think, to stave this off, lest any of them fail to eventuate. But thank you for your incredible work in all of this and for coming back and telling us more about it. I hope you'll do so again in the near future, sir. This is vital.
That'd be great.
I've
Thank
learned
you.
a lot myself, and I'm sure our audience has as well. God bless you, Dr. Mark Richards. We'll be right back with, no, we won't. We're going to say goodbye. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Securing America. I hope you come back for more next time. Until then, go forth and multiply.